In this episode, we start with a simple truth that surprises many new learners. In artificial intelligence, AI, law is not just a document for lawyers to read and then forget. It is a set of duties that must show up in everyday work, in design decisions, in testing notes, in approval paths, and in the records an organization keeps after a system goes live. A modern risk-based law such as the European Union (EU) AI Act does not only ask whether a system seems useful or innovative. It asks whether the people building or using that system can show, in a disciplined way, that they identified important risks, reduced those risks where possible, documented what they did, and kept enough evidence to prove it later. That is why this topic matters so much for the Artificial Intelligence Governance Professional (AIGP) certification. If you understand how legal requirements become operating habits, you stop seeing compliance as paperwork and start seeing it as a way to make AI systems safer, more explainable, and easier to defend under scrutiny. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good way to understand operationalizing the law is to think of the gap between a rule on paper and a routine in practice. A law might require risk management, but an organization still has to decide who owns that process, when reviews happen, what evidence is saved, and how new findings get back into the system. A law might require documentation, but a team still has to decide whether that documentation is a living record that changes with the system or a stale file written once for a launch meeting. A law might require record keeping, but someone still has to decide what gets logged, how long it is kept, who can access it, and how privacy is protected. In other words, operationalization means turning abstract duties into repeatable behavior. The exam wants you to hear the difference between saying we comply and being able to show how compliance actually happens from planning through deployment, monitoring, updates, and eventual retirement. Risk management sits at the center of that work because most major AI laws use a risk-based approach rather than a one-size-fits-all rule for every system. That means the law usually pays closer attention to systems that can seriously affect health, safety, or fundamental rights, while lighter uses may face fewer obligations. For a beginner, the key lesson is that risk is not just about whether a model makes mistakes. Risk is about what kinds of harm those mistakes can create, who can be affected, how severe the impact could be, and whether people have a realistic chance to notice, challenge, or recover from the problem. A recommendation engine for music and a system that helps evaluate job applicants may both use machine learning, but the legal concern is very different because the stakes are different. Once you understand that, the legal focus on context makes more sense. Compliance begins not with code, but with a clear view of purpose, setting, affected people, and possible consequences. When the law calls for a risk management system, it is not asking for a dramatic once-a-year workshop with a slide deck and a sign-in sheet. It is asking for a continuous process that is created, used, documented, maintained, reviewed, and updated throughout the life of the system. That matters because an AI system can change in ways that are obvious, such as a new model version, and in ways that are less obvious, such as different user behavior, new input data patterns, or a new business context. A system that looked acceptable during development may create new issues after release because real people interact with it in messy ways that testing never fully captured. Good risk management therefore starts before launch, continues during operation, and keeps feeding back into decisions after the system is in use. The exam often rewards this life cycle view. It is a strong sign of maturity when a team treats risk management as an ongoing loop instead of a gate they pass through one time. To make that more concrete, imagine a hiring support system that ranks applicants, a student support system that flags learners for intervention, or a claims review system that helps decide who receives deeper scrutiny. In each case, the organization should ask what harms are known and what harms are reasonably foreseeable, even if the team did not intend those harms. Could the system steer decision-makers toward unfair outcomes for certain groups? Could users place too much trust in scores that seem precise but are actually weak signals? Could missing or poor quality data create patterns that look objective even though they are incomplete or biased? Could the system be used in a way that goes beyond its intended purpose because a manager repurposes it for a faster but less appropriate task? Risk management becomes real when a team moves from vague concern to specific harm scenarios, affected stakeholders, likely causes, and realistic conditions of misuse. That step is essential because you cannot reduce a risk you have not described clearly. Once risks are described, the next question is what to do about them. And this is where students often make the mistake of thinking law only wants a warning label. In practice, a mature response starts by asking whether a risk can be reduced through design and development rather than by simply telling users to be careful. Maybe the system should use a narrower purpose, more constrained outputs, clearer thresholds, stronger validation, or a requirement for human review before a result influences a person. Maybe some features should be removed because the added convenience is not worth the extra legal and ethical exposure. Maybe the organization needs fallback procedures for cases where the model is uncertain or where the consequences of error are too serious. The legal idea of residual risk is helpful here. Even after controls are added, some risk remains, and the organization has to judge whether what remains is acceptable in light of the system's purpose, the people affected, and the safeguards in place. This leads naturally to documentation, which many beginners imagine as a binder full of dense language that nobody reads. In reality, technical documentation is supposed to be the structured story of the system. It explains what the system is for, what version is being used, how it fits into a broader workflow, what data and methods shaped it, what assumptions guided the design, how performance was evaluated, what limitations are known, and what controls were built around its use. Good documentation is not written only for the organization's own memory. It is also written so a reviewer, assessor, regulator, auditor, or other responsible party can understand whether the system meets the relevant legal requirements. That is why documentation must be clear, current, and connected to reality. If the real system changes but the documentation does not, then the paperwork stops being evidence and starts becoming a liability. A useful way to think about documentation is that it should answer the questions a skeptical and informed outsider would ask. What exactly is this system intended to do? And just as important, what is it not intended to do? What populations or situations was it designed around? What data supported its development? And what are the known quality limits of that data? What performance boundaries were observed in testing? And under what conditions might those numbers no longer hold? What design trade-offs were made? And why were those trade-offs considered reasonable at the time? How are changes controlled? And how does the team know when a change is significant enough to trigger new review? Documentation becomes powerful when it captures rationale, not just results. A future reviewer may disagree with a decision, but if the reasoning is visible, disciplined, and consistent with the evidence available at the time, the organization is in a much stronger position. Record keeping is related to documentation, but it is not the same thing, and that distinction matters on the exam. Documentation tells the planned and designed story of the system. Records and logs show what actually happened while the system was built, tested, deployed, and used. A log might show when a system was run, what version produced an output, when a human overrode a result, or when an anomaly occurred that required escalation. Other records may show approvals, test outcomes, change requests, incident reviews, data source updates, complaints, or retraining decisions. Without those records, an organization may have a polished narrative but no proof. With them, the organization has traceability, which is the ability to reconstruct key events and decisions after the fact. Traceability is valuable not only for regulators. It is also what allows internal teams to investigate problems, learn from near misses, and separate a one-off error from a deeper pattern. Modern AI law treats logging and record retention as practical compliance tools, not as optional extras. For high-risk systems under the EU AI Act, the system must allow automatic event logging over its lifetime so that important events can be traced, post-market monitoring can happen, and system operation can be reviewed appropriately. The same framework also expects providers to keep core compliance documentation available for 10 years after a high-risk system is placed on the market or put into service, and to retain logs under their control for a period that fits the system's purpose and is at least 6 months unless another law says otherwise. The numbers matter less than the lesson behind them. Lawmakers are signaling that evidence must still exist when questions arise later, sometimes long after launch. A team that deletes too much too early may save storage space, but it also destroys the very material needed to investigate harm, prove diligence, and respond credibly to oversight. Another important point is that record keeping should be designed, not improvised after a problem occurs. If a team waits until an incident happens and then realizes it cannot tell which model version made a recommendation, who approved a change, or whether the input conditions were unusual, the damage is already done. Good operationalization means deciding in advance which events matter, which decisions need a durable trail, and how those records can be interpreted later by people who were not in the room at the time. That often means linking several layers of evidence together so that a system version connects to test results, change approvals, deployment dates, user guidance, and incident handling notes. At the same time, good record keeping is disciplined rather than excessive. Organizations should not collect every imaginable detail forever. They should collect the details that support legal duties, operational learning, and fair accountability while also respecting privacy, security, and data minimization obligations. This is also where post-market monitoring becomes essential. Compliance is not complete on launch day because the law assumes that some risks will only become visible during real-world use. A provider may receive signals from users, operators, affected individuals, customer support, incident reports, or downstream business teams that the system behaves differently than expected. New risks may appear when the system interacts with other software, when user populations change, or when a model is applied in conditions that were foreseeable but not well tested. A strong operating model, therefore, gathers relevant performance and incident information actively and systematically over time, analyzes it, and feeds it back into the risk management process and the documentation. This closes the loop between design assumptions and operational reality. In simple terms, post-market monitoring asks whether the system is still behaving in a way that matches the claims, controls, and limits described before launch. Operationalizing these duties usually requires cross-functional governance rather than a single compliance owner working alone. Legal teams can interpret obligations, but they cannot by themselves create logs that engineering never designed, or produce testing records that product teams never required, or preserve evidence that operations teams routinely delete. Engineers understand the system, product leaders understand the purpose and business context, compliance and privacy teams understand control expectations, and operational staff often see the first signs that something is going wrong. A mature organization connects those perspectives through clear ownership, regular review points, and rules for escalation when evidence shows risk is rising. Even a small organization can do this if responsibilities are explicit. Someone must own the risk register, someone must maintain living documentation, someone must review changes, someone must track incidents, and someone must ensure retention rules are actually being followed rather than assumed. Beginners should also watch for several common misconceptions that can quietly undermine compliance. One mistake is thinking that a highly accurate model is automatically a legally acceptable model, even when the system is used for the wrong purpose or without adequate safeguards. Another mistake is assuming that buying a third-party model transfers all legal responsibility away from the organization using it. A vendor may provide helpful documentation, but if your organization builds the system into a real workflow, relies on the output, or controls important parts of operation, your duties do not disappear. A third mistake is treating documentation as a last-minute writing task rather than a running evidence practice. A fourth is collecting logs without making sure anyone can interpret them later. The point of operationalization is not to create piles of files. It is to create defensible clarity about what the system does, what risks were considered, what controls were chosen, and what happened over time. By the time you sit for the exam, you should be able to hear this whole topic as one connected chain rather than 3 separate compliance chores. Risk management identifies and evaluates what could go wrong and what should be done about it. Documentation explains the system, its purpose, its assumptions, its controls, and the reasoning behind key decisions. Record keeping preserves the evidence of what actually happened before and after release so that the organization can investigate issues, learn from experience, and demonstrate accountability. When those three pieces work together, legal compliance becomes far more than a checklist. It becomes a disciplined operating model for trustworthy AI. That is the real lesson to carry forward from this episode. A lawful system is not just a system with a clever model or a good intention, but a system with a traceable, reviewable, and continuously maintained body of evidence behind it.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.